I'm sorry, ma'am.
Thank you, sweetheart. This isn't your fault.
Maybe expensive dinners should be paid for by the person who actually earns the money.
The thing that haunted Grant Holloway wasn't the joke. It wasn't the affair. It wasn't losing clients, his reputation, or the marriage he spent years believing would always be there. It was 3 words. Thank you, sweetheart. He still heard them sometimes, not because Naomi had said them to him. She hadn't. She'd said them to a frightened 20-year-old waiter whose hands were shaking as he held out her declined credit card in the middle of one of Winter Park's most prestigious charity galas. I'm so sorry, ma'am, the young man whispered. Would you like me to try it again? Naomi looked at his name tag before she answered. Ethan. Her voice was gentle. Thank you, sweetheart. This isn't your fault. The poor kid looked relieved. Grant smiled. He actually smiled. You know, he said, leaning back in his chair just enough for the surrounding tables to hear, maybe expensive dinners should be paid for by the person who actually earns the money. A few people laughed because they didn't know what else to do. Most stared at their plates. One woman quietly reached for her husband's hand beneath the table. Naomi didn't defend herself. She didn't ask Grant why he would say something like that. She didn't remind anyone that she'd spent years helping build the life they shared. She simply slipped the card back into her purse, thanked the waiter one more time, wished everyone at the table a pleasant evening, and walked toward the ballroom doors with the kind of quiet dignity that can make an entire room question itself. Grant watched her leave. He honestly believed he'd won. Looking back, he would later realize something that still kept him awake years afterward. The card being declined wasn't the beginning of the end. Naomi's silence was, because by the time she stood up from that table, she had already stopped trying to save the man she loved. She simply hadn't told him yet. Welcome to Mr. Graham's story, my beautiful, amazing family. Y'all have been so supportive, and I promise to always do my best to give you the best as I learn and improve every day. If this is your first time watching, comment below with where you're watching from, and subscribe to officially join the family. The strange part is that none of the people sitting in that ballroom, not Grant, not the guests, not even Naomi, could see how long this moment had really been building. To understand why she walked away without saying a single angry word, you have to go back to a spring afternoon years earlier, when 2 strangers escaped a crowded charity fundraiser in search of dessert, and found a life they both believed would last forever. 3 years before anyone at the Winter Park Charity Gala watched Naomi walk away without looking back. She was hiding in a hallway, trying to avoid the exact kind of people who would later applaud Grant. The ballroom buzzed with expensive conversations. Men compared investment portfolios. Women exchanged business cards while complimenting one another's dresses. Laughter echoed a little too loudly. Everything felt polished. Everything felt rehearsed. Naomi balanced a small dessert plate in one hand and quietly slipped through a side doorway that opened onto a shaded courtyard. She took a slow breath. Much better. The courtyard was almost empty. Oak trees filtered the late afternoon sunlight, and a small fountain covered the distant noise from inside the hotel. She sat on a stone bench and looked down at the single slice of lemon tart she'd rescued before escaping. Her father would have laughed. Whenever people asked why he attended charity events if he disliked crowds so much, he'd always answer the same way. They usually serve good dessert. She smiled to herself. You were right again, Dad. You talking to yourself? The voice startled her. She looked up. A tall man in a navy suit stood near the fountain, holding a coffee cup instead of a wine glass. He looked equally uncomfortable. For a second, neither of them spoke. Then he lifted his cup slightly. I'm hoping that's not reserved seating. Naomi laughed. I don't think the bench has a guest list. Good. He sat at the opposite end, not too close, not awkwardly far away, just enough space for 2 strangers who hadn't decided whether they intended to become acquainted. For nearly half a minute, they listened to the fountain without saying anything. Finally, the man nodded toward the ballroom. Too much networking? Naomi smiled. You too? I've shaken so many hands today, I'm starting to forget my own name. She laughed. I came out here because everyone inside seems to be trying to become somebody. He looked at her. And you? I was hoping to eat dessert before somebody asked what I do for a living. He grinned. I should have brought cake. She held up the plate. You came unprepared. I underestimated the importance of dessert. That's your first mistake. He laughed. I'm Grant. Naomi. They shook hands. His grip was firm but relaxed. Nothing about him suggested the polished confidence she would later see him develop. At that moment, he looked more relieved than impressive. So, Grant asked, what are you hiding from? Naomi looked toward the ballroom doors. A man who keeps introducing me to people. Same man introducing me to investors? The one wearing the bright blue tie? Grant blinked. You know him? I've spent 20 minutes trying not to. He laughed harder than he expected. I knew I wasn't the only one. The conversation became surprisingly easy after that. Grant admitted he'd almost skipped the fundraiser because networking exhausted him. Naomi confessed she accepted invitations mostly because her father believed supporting local charities mattered more than enjoying the events themselves. They discovered they both preferred quiet restaurants over exclusive clubs. Neither liked talking about money. Both secretly judged dinner parties by the quality of the dessert. When Grant mentioned he'd recently become a financial advisor, Naomi looked genuinely interested. Do you enjoy it? I like helping people. He shrugged. The sales part. He made a face. I'm still figuring that out. She nodded. My dad always says people can tell when someone wants their trust more than their business. Grant leaned forward. I like that. He repeats it constantly. Smart man. He is. Naomi smiled. He also says reputation grows slowly and disappears all at once. Grant laughed. I hope he's wrong about that one. So do I. Neither of them realized how strangely those words would sound years later. A volunteer stepped into the courtyard. There you both are. Grant looked over. We've been looking for you. He smiled apologetically. We escaped. The volunteer laughed. I noticed. As the woman walked away again, Grant looked at Naomi. I should probably go back inside. You probably should. He stood, then hesitated. I know this might sound strange. What? I've had better conversations waiting in line for coffee. Naomi smiled. I'll take that as a compliment. It is. Another brief silence settled between them, the comfortable kind, not the awkward kind. Grant rubbed the back of his neck. Would you let me buy you coffee sometime? Naomi looked at him for a moment. Normally, she would have politely declined, not because there was anything wrong with him, because her life was already full. Her father was recovering from another round of treatment. Work demanded long hours. Dating wasn't exactly a priority, but something about Grant felt unforced. He hadn't asked what her last name was. He hadn't asked who she knew. He hadn't tried to impress her. He'd simply made her laugh. She reached into her purse, found a receipt from the dessert table, and wrote her number on the back. Coffee, she said as she handed it to him. But only if you promise not to take me to another fundraiser. Grant folded the receipt carefully and slipped it into his jacket pocket. Deal. He smiled. I think I know a place with terrible coffee. She laughed. And good dessert? The best lemon pie in Winter Park. Naomi raised an eyebrow. That's a bold claim. I guess you'll have to verify it. As Grant walked back toward the ballroom, he caught himself smiling for no particular reason. Naomi watched him disappear through the doors before looking down at the last bite of lemon tart on her plate. She had come to the fundraiser expecting another forgettable afternoon of polite conversations. Instead, she had met the one person who made her feel like she didn't have to perform. Neither of them knew it then. But the strongest marriages rarely begin with fireworks. Sometimes, they begin with two people quietly escaping the same room. The coffee turned out to be exactly as Grant had promised. Terrible. Naomi took one sip, set the mug down, and looked at him. This is awful. Grant tasted his own. He nodded once. It really is. You brought me here anyway. I may have oversold the coffee. You definitely oversold the coffee. But, he pointed toward the display case. The lemon pie. Naomi smiled. I'll reserve judgment. By the end of the afternoon, the pie had almost disappeared, and neither of them had noticed the cafe emptying around them. They talked until chairs began turning upside down on nearby tables. Not about careers, not about money, about childhoods, favorite teachers, the places they wanted to visit someday. Grant admitted he'd grown up believing success was the safest way to earn love. His father had worked hard, expected even harder, and rarely celebrated anything that wasn't another achievement. An A wasn't enough if someone else earned an A+. Second place meant trying harder. Rest wasn't something you deserved. It was something you earned. I spent a lot of my life thinking I had to become somebody before people would keep me around, he admitted. Naomi stirred the last of her coffee. My parents weren't like that. No? She shook her head. My dad used to tell me that if people only respected us when things were going well, then it wasn't respect. Grant looked at her. What was it? Convenience. He sat quietly for a moment. Then he smiled. I think I'd like your dad. You would. Over the next year, neither of them tried to become the center of the other's world. They simply became part of it. Grant learned that Naomi called her mother every Sunday evening without fail. Naomi learned that Grant always bought too many groceries because he hated the idea of running out of food. He never remembered birthdays without reminders. She could never remember where she'd left her car keys. He talked through problems. She thought about them before speaking. Instead of arguing over those differences, they laughed at them. One rainy Saturday, Grant showed up outside Naomi's townhouse carrying 2 grocery bags. She opened the door. What happened? You said you were making soup. I am. I brought bread. She looked inside the bag. You brought 4 loaves. I wasn't sure what kind you liked. She laughed so hard she had to lean against the door frame. Grant. What? There are 2 of us. I panicked. You panicked? I've never dated someone who makes homemade soup. She stepped aside. You'd better come in before all this bread goes stale. Those were the kinds of stories they carried into marriage. Nothing dramatic, nothing impressive. The kind of memories that become family stories because they're ordinary enough to happen again. When Grant proposed, he didn't rent out a restaurant or hire photographers. He waited until the end of one of their evening walks around Lake Virginia. The sun had almost disappeared. The path had grown quiet. He stopped near the water. Naomi looked at him. What? He reached into his jacket. She immediately shook her head. No. He smiled nervously. I haven't even asked yet. I know. So? She laughed through unexpected tears. Yes. You don't know what I'm saying yes. He stood there, holding the ring box. You could at least pretend to let me finish. She wiped at her eyes. I've been waiting 20 minutes. He laughed. So have I. Their wedding, 8 months later, reflected exactly who they were. Small, elegant, family, close friends, no celebrity planner, no magazine photographer, just people who genuinely loved them. Naomi's father was still healthy enough to walk her down the aisle. Halfway there, he leaned toward her and whispered, Too late to run. She smiled without looking at him. I think so. Good. So do I. Grant watched them from the front with tears already forming before the ceremony had even begun. During the reception, Naomi's father stood to make a toast. He wasn't a man who enjoyed long speeches. He held his glass for a moment before speaking. I've spent my life around numbers. A few guests smiled. They're useful. He looked at Grant. But numbers have never told me who deserves trust. The room grew quiet. He continued. Character does. He raised his glass. Take care of each other on ordinary days. He smiled warmly. Almost everyone remembers anniversaries. It's Tuesdays that decide whether a marriage lasts. People laughed softly. Grant laughed too. Years later, those words would return to him with painful clarity. The first years of marriage passed with the kind of happiness that rarely makes exciting stories. Saturday mornings belonged to the farmer's market. Grant still accepted every free food sample offered to him. Naomi still pretended to be surprised when he came home with flowers for no particular reason. They hosted friends for backyard dinners, burned garlic bread more than once, argued over which movie to watch, fell asleep halfway through most of them anyway. When Naomi's father retired from day-to-day responsibilities at the bank because of declining health, he asked if she would quietly assume a greater role in the family's governance. She agreed on one condition: no announcements. He smiled. I was hoping you'd say that. Public titles had never mattered to her. Responsibility did. Only a handful of people inside the institution knew how much influence she actually carried. Grant knew her father trusted her. He knew she attended board meetings from time to time. He never asked for details. Not because she was hiding anything, because work rarely followed them home. Looking back, that quiet trust may have been the healthiest thing about their marriage. Neither felt the need to impress the other. Neither measured love by status. And for a while, they were exactly the kind of couple people quietly wished they could become. Neither of them noticed that success had already begun knocking on Grant's door. And success, when welcomed without caution, has a way of asking for far more than it first appears. People often imagine marriages begin falling apart with one terrible fight, a betrayal, a slammed door, a confession. Looking back, Naomi knew that wasn't true. Their marriage didn't begin breaking with an explosion. It began with applause. Grant's business grew faster than anyone expected. One satisfied client referred another, then another. Within 3 years, he was managing accounts he had once dreamed of attracting. He worked hard. Nobody questioned that. He answered late-night calls, spent weekends helping anxious retirees, talked young couples through their first investments. The success was earned. Naomi celebrated every milestone. When he landed one of the largest accounts of his career, she surprised him with dinner at the little Italian restaurant where they'd celebrated their first anniversary. Grant looked around the table. You planned this? She smiled. I thought it deserved celebrating. You didn't have to. I wanted to. He reached across the table and squeezed her hand. I couldn't have done it without you. She laughed softly. I don't remember attending any client meetings. You know what I mean. She did, and she believed him. A few months later, Grant was invited to speak at a regional investment conference. It was his first appearance as a featured guest instead of just another attendee. Naomi sat near the back of the ballroom while he spoke. He wasn't flashy. He wasn't the loudest speaker. He simply sounded honest. People listened. Afterward, several attendees surrounded him with questions. Naomi waited patiently near the exit. She'd learned long ago that successful people rarely left events on time. Eventually, Grant found her. Sorry, you have nothing to apologize for. They kept asking questions. I noticed. He smiled. I still can't believe people actually wanted my opinion. Naomi straightened his tie. They wanted your judgment. That's different. It is. He kissed her forehead. Thank you for coming. I'll always come. Neither of them realized how much those words would matter later. As Grant's reputation expanded, invitations followed. Private dinners, leadership retreats, country club events, real estate launches, charity planning committees. People who had barely noticed him a few years earlier now greeted him by name. At first, he found it amusing, then flattering, eventually necessary. One evening, they attended another fundraiser together. Grant spent nearly 40 minutes talking with local developers. Naomi wandered toward the silent auction tables. An elderly volunteer recognized her immediately. Oh, Naomi. She smiled warmly. It's so good to see you. You too. Your father called last week. How's he doing? Still giving everyone advice. The volunteer laughed. He says retirement simply means having meetings at home. Naomi smiled. That sounds exactly like him. Before walking away, the woman leaned closer. We're grateful your family never stopped supporting this foundation. Naomi squeezed her hand. The foundation matters more than our name. Grant returned a few minutes later. Everything okay? Of course. Who was that? A volunteer. He glanced across the room. She seemed to know you well. Naomi shrugged. My parents have supported the foundation for years. He nodded. Nothing more. The conversation ended there. It should have stayed there. A few weeks later, Grant attended a networking dinner without Naomi. When he came home, he loosened his tie and dropped into the kitchen chair. You know what's funny? What? The room changes when certain people walk in. Naomi poured him a cup of coffee. What do you mean? Everyone suddenly wants to talk to them. That happens. I wonder what that's like. She smiled. You'll probably find out. He laughed. You really think so? I know so. Grant looked at her for a moment. You always make success sound smaller than everyone else does. I don't think success is small. She handed him the mug. I just don't think it's the most interesting thing about you. He smiled politely, but something about the answer disappointed him. He didn't know why. A month later, he bought his first luxury watch. It cost more than any watch he'd ever owned. When he showed Naomi, she admired it. It looks beautiful. He waited. She looked back at him. What? I thought you'd say more. She laughed. What else should I say? I don't know. Are you happy with it? I am. Then I'm happy for you. She kissed him lightly before walking upstairs to answer a call from her mother. Grant looked back down at the watch, for reasons he couldn't explain. Her approval suddenly felt too quiet, not because Naomi had changed, because something inside him had. The following Friday, he accepted an invitation to a luxury real estate showcase hosted by one of Winter Park's fastest rising agents. Her name was Claire Kensington. She was known for selling homes most people only drove past. When Grant arrived, Claire greeted him with an easy confidence. I've heard a lot about you. Grant smiled. I hope only the good things. She laughed. The interesting things. Before introducing him to a group of investors, she adjusted his name badge slightly and said something no one had ever said to him before. You know, Grant. She smiled as if she were sharing a harmless observation. People like you usually don't realize how impressive they are until someone else points it out. Grant laughed. So I've been told. No. She looked directly at him. I don't think anyone's told you nearly enough. It lasted less than 10 seconds. Nothing inappropriate happened. No flirting, no lingering touch, no secret meeting. Just one sentence, one compliment, one moment. Looking back, Naomi would later realize that was the first crack. Not because another woman entered their lives, because for the first time, Grant walked into a room hoping someone would tell him who he was. And someone did. Grant didn't notice the change because it arrived disguised as success. For nearly a year after meeting Claire, nothing happened that anyone could point to and call an affair. That was exactly why it was dangerous. She never flirted in obvious ways. She never crossed a line that would force him to defend himself. Instead, she became the person who always seemed to understand him before he finished speaking. The first time she invited him to lunch, there were 4 other professionals at the table. The second time, 3. By the 5th lunch, it was only the 2 of them. Neither thought much of it. They talked about clients, luxury developments, changing markets, the growing number of affluent families moving into Central Florida. Claire knew almost everyone, or at least she knew how to make it seem that way. One afternoon, she pointed toward a newly finished waterfront estate. Beautiful house. Grant nodded. It'll probably sell this week. It already has. He looked surprised. You serious? She smiled. Closed yesterday. You move fast. No. She stirred her iced tea. I move before everyone else realizes they're late. Grant laughed. I wish investing worked like that. It does. He looked at her. How? The people who succeed first usually aren't smarter. They're simply willing to believe they're supposed to be in the room. Grant smiled politely. She wasn't finished. You still walk into meetings trying to earn permission. He frowned. I don't. You do. She leaned back. I watch people for a living. You apologize before giving your opinion. I don't apologize. You soften it. Grant opened his mouth to argue, then stopped. Because she was right. She noticed. You've been doing it since the day we met. He laughed awkwardly. I didn't realize. Most people don't. That conversation stayed with him. A week later, during a client presentation, Grant noticed himself speaking differently, more directly, more confidently. The meeting went well, very well. Driving home, he caught himself thinking, Claire was right. The thought bothered him, not because she had been right, because he hadn't been able to stop thinking about it. Meanwhile, home remained exactly what it had always been. Safe, predictable. One Tuesday evening, Naomi stood at the kitchen counter making chicken pot pie from her grandmother's recipe. Grant walked in carrying his briefcase. The smell hit him immediately. He smiled. I haven't had this in months. I know. She brushed flour from her hands. You mentioned it a few weeks ago. He looked at her. I did? You probably don't remember. She smiled. But I do. Grant wrapped his arms around her from behind. Thank you. For what? For remembering. She laughed. That's what wives do. Dinner was simple. They talked about a neighbor whose dog kept escaping, a new bakery opening downtown, whether they should finally replace the old patio furniture. Nothing dramatic, nothing extraordinary. The kind of evening that had once made Grant feel fortunate. Now, part of him found himself comparing it to lunch with Claire. Not because he loved Claire. He didn't. Because lunch made him feel ambitious. Home made him feel settled. He didn't understand why those feelings had started competing with one another. Several weeks later, Grant received an industry award recognizing one of the fastest-growing advisory practices in the region. Naomi surprised him with tickets to a jazz concert. He smiled when he opened the envelope. You remembered. Of course. You bought these months ago. I had a feeling. He kissed her. I don't deserve you. She laughed. I wasn't aware this was something to deserve. That evening, they dressed up, enjoyed dinner, and walked hand in hand toward the theater. Halfway there, Grant's phone buzzed. He glanced down. Claire, congratulations. I knew you were going to win before you did. Proud of you. He smiled without realizing it. Naomi noticed. What happened? He slipped the phone back into his pocket. One of the partners sent a message. She nodded. That's nice. He hated himself a little, because lying had become easier than explaining. Not easier because Naomi would have been upset. Easier because he no longer wanted to answer questions he couldn't answer himself. That was the first lie. Not about where he was, not about who he loved, about something so ordinary it barely seemed worth mentioning. And that's how emotional betrayal usually begins. Not with a hotel room, not with a kiss, with the quiet decision to stop inviting the person you love into your everyday thoughts. Months passed. Grant and Claire continued working together. They never held hands, never disappeared together, never gave anyone a reason to whisper. But Claire learned things Naomi no longer heard. Which clients excited him, which opportunities frustrated him, which dreams still kept him awake at night. One rainy evening, after a long development meeting, Claire looked at him across the restaurant. You know what I like about you? Grant smiled. I'm almost afraid to ask. You've outgrown the life you're still pretending fits. Grant frowned. What does that mean? She shrugged. I don't think you've figured it out yet. The waitress arrived with the check. Grant reached for it. Claire gently placed her hand over the folder before he could. My treat. You paid last time. I know. I can pay. She looked at him for a second. I wasn't trying to save you money. He looked confused. I was trying to celebrate you. Grant didn't know why those words stayed with him all the way home. When he pulled into the driveway, the porch light was already on. Naomi had left it burning, just as she always did whenever he worked late. She opened the front door before he reached it. I kept dinner warm. He smiled. I'm sorry I'm late. I know. She took his wet jacket. Long day? Yeah. She nodded. The pot pie's probably dry by now. Grant laughed. I'll eat it anyway. She smiled back. Neither of them noticed it then, but somewhere between the woman who always remembered his favorite meal and the woman who always remembered his biggest ambitions, Grant had quietly started measuring love against admiration, and he didn't yet understand. that they were never the same thing. Naomi didn't wake up one morning convinced her husband was having an affair. If someone had asked her when the feeling started, she wouldn't have had an answer. It arrived the way water finds a crack in a wall, slowly, quietly, until one day you realize the stain has been growing for months. The first thing she noticed wasn't Grant's phone. It was his stories, or rather, the lack of them. Grant had always come home with something to tell her. A nervous young couple buying their first home. A retired teacher finally taking the vacation she'd postponed for 20 years. A client who insisted on bringing homemade cookies to every meeting. Those stories slowly disappeared. Now, when she asked about his day, the answers became shorter. Busy. Good. Long. Nothing was technically wrong, but nothing felt shared anymore. One evening, they were cleaning the kitchen together after dinner. Grant dried the plates. Naomi put them away. It was one of those little routines they had fallen into years earlier. Without looking at him, she asked, "How's Claire's waterfront project coming?" Grant stopped drying the plate, only for a second. Then he continued, "It's going well. You've mentioned it a lot lately. Big project." She nodded. "I'm glad it's working out." The conversation ended there. She wasn't testing him. She simply noticed something. Grant never asked how she knew which projects belonged to Claire. He assumed she'd forgotten. She hadn't. A week later, Naomi met her mother for lunch. Her mother studied her across the table for a moment before asking, "Is everything all right?" Naomi looked up. "Why?" "You've answered 3 questions with one-word answers." Naomi smiled faintly. "I learned from Dad." Her mother didn't smile back. "You're worried." Naomi looked down at her tea. "I don't know if I'm worried." "What are you then?" She searched for the right word. "Confused." Her mother waited. "Grant's still kind." Naomi continued quietly. "He still kisses me goodbye. He still thanks me for dinner. He still asks about my day. So, Dad." She looked out the window. "It feels like part of him gets home before the rest of him does." Her mother understood immediately. She didn't offer advice. She simply reached across the table and covered Naomi's hand. Sometimes being understood hurts almost as much as being hurt. 2 Fridays later, Naomi attended a hospital fundraising breakfast without Grant. He'd apologized the night before. A client meeting. She believed him, or at least she wanted to. As the breakfast ended, she stopped near the valet stand to wait for her car. Across the street sat a small cafe. She wasn't looking for anyone. She wasn't even paying attention, until she laughed. Not because something was funny, because she recognized Grant's laugh before she recognized him. He sat near the window. Claire sat across from him. Neither noticed Naomi. Grant leaned forward as Claire finished telling a story. He laughed the way he used to laugh at home, openly, without checking the time, without looking at his phone. The valet pulled Naomi's car to the curb. "Your vehicle, ma'am." She thanked him, got in, and drove away. She never crossed the street, never interrupted, never demanded an explanation, because nothing she had seen proved anything. 2 colleagues having lunch, that was all. At least, that was all she kept telling herself. 3 nights later, Grant fell asleep on the couch while watching television. His phone buzzed on the coffee table. The screen lit up. Naomi wasn't trying to read it. The light simply caught her eye. One message, one line. "I wish you could have stayed longer today." No hearts, no kisses, no declarations, no name. The screen went dark again. Naomi sat perfectly still. She could have picked up the phone. She didn't. She could have unlocked it. She knew the passcode. She didn't. Instead, she picked up the blanket that had slipped onto the floor and gently covered Grant's shoulders. He stirred slightly. Half asleep, he whispered, "Thanks, sweetheart." She stood there, looking at him for a long moment. Then she turned off the television and walked upstairs alone. The next morning, she made breakfast exactly as she always had. Coffee, toast, scrambled eggs. Grant smiled as he sat down. "You spoil me." She smiled back. "I know. He kissed her forehead before leaving for work. See you tonight. Drive safely. After the front door closed, Naomi carried her untouched cup of coffee to the dining room. She opened a small notebook, not to gather evidence, not to build a case, simply because she was afraid memory would eventually argue with her heart. On the first page, she wrote one sentence, "Things that don't feel like us." Then she closed the notebook, not because she had reached a conclusion, because she wasn't ready to. She still loved him. And love has a strange way of asking for one more explanation, even after your instincts have already heard the truth. Naomi never intended to become the kind of wife who checked timestamps. She hated that version of herself, not because it was wrong, because it meant something inside her marriage had already changed. She carried the little notebook everywhere now. It stayed inside her work bag, beside her planner. Most days she never opened it. When she did, she wrote only facts. No opinions, no accusations. Tuesday, dinner canceled. Thursday, home after 10. Saturday, conference became client dinner. Just enough to keep her heart from rewriting history. She hoped she'd eventually throw the notebook away and laugh at herself. Instead, it kept getting fuller. The second secret found her by accident, not through Grant, through work. The following Tuesday, Naomi attended the quarterly governance and risk committee meeting at First Heritage Private Bank. She sat halfway down the conference table, listening far more than she spoke. That was how she'd always led. The meeting moved through routine reports, commercial lending, cybersecurity updates, operational audits, nothing unusual. Then the chief compliance officer changed slides. The room grew noticeably quieter. We've identified several investment accounts requiring enhanced review. No one interrupted. He continued, There are documentation timing issues we need to verify. One board member asked, Material? Potentially. Client impact? Still being assessed. Naomi kept reading. She noticed one familiar detail, not the clients. Their names had been redacted, not the dollar amounts. Those were confidential. It was the outside advisory firm handling several of the accounts. Holloway Financial Partners, Grant's firm. Her eyes stopped moving across the page. Only for a second. Then she continued reading, as though nothing had happened. Nobody around the table noticed. When the meeting ended, people slowly filtered toward the hallway. Naomi remained seated. The chief compliance officer approached. Everything all right? She closed the folder. I need to disclose a conflict. He already understood. Your husband. She nodded. I don't know any details beyond what's in today's packet. And I'd like to keep it that way. He pulled out a notepad. You'd like to recuse yourself. Immediately. He looked at her for a moment. You understand that means you won't receive future updates. I shouldn't. You trust the process? I helped build the process. He smiled faintly. I'll notify legal. Thank you. That was the entire conversation. No favors, no questions, no requests. Naomi walked out carrying only her notebook. Outside, she sat in her car for several minutes without starting the engine. Claire, the late nights, the messages, now this. She rested both hands on the steering wheel. Please. The word escaped before she realized she'd spoken. Don't let these be connected. Not because she wanted Grant protected, because she wanted one part of her life to remain true. If her marriage was falling apart, perhaps his work wasn't. If his work had problems, perhaps the marriage could still be saved. She silently bargained with possibilities that no longer felt entirely real. That evening, Grant came home carrying a white bakery box. I brought dessert. Naomi looked up from the kitchen. Lemon pie? He smiled. They had one left. For a moment, she forgot everything. The fundraiser, the notebook, Claire. She remembered two strangers sharing pie after escaping a ballroom years earlier. Grant noticed the smile. There it is. What? I haven't seen you smile like that in a while. She looked down at the box. I was remembering something. Good memory? The best kind. He set the pie on the counter. Then let's not ruin it. They ate dessert together. They talked about absolutely nothing important. The pie wasn't quite as good as the little cafe where they'd first met. Grant complained about that. Naomi teased him for becoming a dessert critic. For 20 peaceful minutes, they sounded exactly like the couple they used to be. That almost hurt more than the silence, because it reminded Naomi that the marriage hadn't disappeared. It was still there, buried beneath things neither of them had chosen to say. Later that night, Grant fell asleep almost immediately. Naomi remained awake. She walked quietly downstairs, opened her father's old leather notebook. She didn't search for advice. She simply let the pages fall open naturally. One sentence had been underlined in blue ink years earlier. The easiest person to deceive is the one who desperately wants the truth to be different. She closed the notebook almost immediately, not because the words frightened her, because they did. Across town, lights remained on inside the bank's compliance department. Analysts compared timestamps, approval records, supporting documents. One investigator looked toward his supervisor. "I think we need another week." The supervisor nodded. "So do I." "No conclusions?" "None." "Just questions?" "For now." Professional investigations didn't begin by deciding someone was guilty. They began by refusing to ignore patterns. Back in the quiet house, Naomi picked up her own notebook one more time. She opened to a blank page. Instead of writing another date, she wrote a single question. When did we stop telling each other the little things? She stared at the words, then slowly closed the cover. She still wasn't preparing for divorce. She still wasn't preparing for confrontation. She was preparing herself for something much harder. The possibility that the man she loved was living two different lives, and she no longer knew which one was real. Grant told himself it wasn't about humiliating Naomi. That lie made the truth easier to live with. The charity gala was only 4 days away. Winter Park treated the event like an unofficial holiday. The city's wealthiest families would be there. Hospital trustees, judges, developers, business owners, bank executives. Every conversation could become another opportunity. Claire stood beside Grant on the balcony of a luxury condominium they had just finished showing to a retired couple from Chicago. The buyers had left. The city stretched below them. Grant smiled. "I think they're going to make an offer." "They will." Claire didn't sound surprised. "You already know?" "I know people." She turned toward him. "Can I ask you something?" He laughed. "That usually means I'm about to be uncomfortable." "Probably." She folded her arms. "When was the last time someone celebrated you the way you deserve?" Grant frowned. "What do you mean?" "I mean, really celebrated you." He shrugged. "Naomi always says she's proud of me." Claire nodded. "I know." She waited. "But that's not what I asked." Grant looked out across the lake. "I don't understand." "I think you do." He stayed quiet. Claire stepped beside him. "You're becoming one of the most respected financial advisors in Central Florida. I've been fortunate." "There." She pointed at him. "You did it again." "What?" "You apologize for succeeding." "I didn't apologize." "You softened it." Grant laughed. "You always catch that." "Because nobody else tells you." She leaned against the railing. "I've watched people congratulate you." "So, they congratulate your work." She looked directly at him. "But they don't understand what you've become." Grant didn't answer. Claire's voice became softer. "And honestly, I don't think Naomi understands either." He looked at her immediately. "That's not fair." "Isn't it? She supports me." "I know she does." Claire nodded. "But support and admiration aren't the same thing." Grant felt something tighten inside him. He wanted to disagree. Instead, he remembered the expensive watch, the industry award, the conference speech. Naomi had smiled every time. She had hugged him, celebrated him, but she'd never seemed impressed. He'd never noticed that before. Now he couldn't stop noticing it. Claire watched the thoughts settle. She didn't push. She simply let silence do its work. Finally she smiled. "You know what?" "What?" "I hope somebody makes a toast about you Thursday night." Grant laughed. "I doubt that'll happen." They should. She picked up her handbag. People deserve to know who keeps this town's money moving. As she walked toward the elevator, Grant remained on the balcony. For the first time, he wondered whether he'd spent years being appreciated, without ever being admired. The following evening, Naomi found him standing in the garage, staring at the old wooden workbench he'd inherited from her father. "What are you doing?" Grant smiled. "Looking for a screwdriver." "You've been looking for 10 minutes. "I know." She reached into the second drawer without hesitation. "There." He laughed. "I swear you hide things." "No." She handed him the screwdriver. "I remember where they belong." He smiled. "You always do." She noticed he looked tired. Not physically, mentally. She touched his arm. "You've been carrying a lot lately." "I'm all right." "You don't have to be." He nodded. "I know." She waited. He said nothing else, so she let the moment pass. That was one of Naomi's greatest strengths. She never forced people to speak before they were ready. She trusted they eventually would. She still believed Grant would. Thursday arrived, the morning of the gala. Grant woke before sunrise. He couldn't fall back asleep. He walked downstairs and poured coffee. His laptop sat open on the kitchen island. He intended to review a presentation. Instead, he logged into the household banking portal. The shared account dashboard appeared. Everyday spending, utility payments, travel expenses, credit cards, nothing unusual. His eyes stopped on one feature, temporarily lock card. He had used it once years earlier, after Naomi misplaced her wallet. One click, instantly reversible. He stared at the screen. An idea formed, small, ridiculous. He almost closed the laptop. Instead, he heard Claire's voice. Support and admiration aren't the same thing. He remembered another conversation from weeks earlier. People should know who keeps this town's money moving. Grant leaned back in his chair. He wasn't trying to hurt Naomi. At least, that wasn't what he told himself. He imagined her reaching for the bill, the card declining, everyone naturally turning toward him. He'd laugh, pay the check, maybe tease her. Nothing serious, just enough for people to notice that he was the provider, just enough for Naomi to understand how the world saw them now. He actually smiled. It felt harmless, almost funny. Without giving himself another chance to think, he clicked the button. Card temporarily locked. Confirmation appeared. Grant closed the laptop. The decision had taken less than 5 seconds. He had no idea. Those 5 seconds were about to become the most expensive decision of his entire life. By the time the ballroom doors opened, every table was already full. Crystal glasses caught the light from the chandeliers. Servers moved through the room with practiced precision. A jazz quartet played softly near the stage. Everything about the evening suggested elegance. Nothing suggested disaster. Grant adjusted his tuxedo jacket as another guest shook his hand. "Congratulations on the Henderson account." "Thank you." "You've been everywhere lately." Grant smiled. "It has been a busy year." Across the room, Naomi stood talking with an elderly volunteer from the Children's Foundation. The woman hugged her warmly. "You still look just like your mother." Naomi laughed. "I'll tell her you said that." "No, don't." The woman grinned. "She'll think I'm trying to borrow money." Both women laughed. Grant noticed the exchange. Again, people always seemed genuinely happy to see Naomi. Not impressed, happy. He couldn't explain why that irritated him tonight. Claire arrived nearly 20 minutes later, wearing a dark emerald evening dress. She wasn't seated at Grant's table. She represented another organization sponsoring the event. As she passed, she caught his eye from across the ballroom. No wave, just a small smile, one that seemed to say, "You've earned tonight." Grant felt strangely taller. Dinner moved smoothly. The auction exceeded expectations. Guests applauded another record-breaking fundraising total. Then coffee arrived, along with pledge cards for guests making additional donations. A young waiter approached their table. He looked nervous, probably new. "Whenever you're ready," he said politely. Naomi reached into her evening purse. "I'll take care of ours." Grant looked at her. "You sure?" She smiled. "Of course." She slid the card into the small leather folder and handed it to the waiter. "Thank you." The young man nodded and disappeared toward the payment station. Grant leaned back. Everything was unfolding exactly as he'd imagined. 30 seconds. That was all. Then he'd quietly unlock the card. A harmless joke. Maybe she'd roll her eyes. Maybe she'd tease him later. He convinced himself she'd eventually laugh. The waiter returned. Only, he looked different. His smile had disappeared. He stopped beside Naomi. "I'm very sorry, ma'am." His voice barely carried across the table. The transaction wasn't approved. Grant waited. Now, this was the moment. The waiter looked genuinely embarrassed. "I can try again if you'd like." Naomi looked at the young man's name tag. "Ethan." He nodded nervously. "I'm sorry." She offered him a gentle smile. "Thank you, sweetheart." His shoulders relaxed a little. "This isn't your fault." Grant watched the exchange. Something about it bothered him. It wasn't going the way he'd imagined. He should have unlocked the card right then. Instead, he smiled. "You know," he said, leaning back just enough for nearby tables to hear, "maybe expensive dinners should be paid for by the person who actually earns the money." Silence. Not complete silence. The quartet kept playing. Silverware still touched china somewhere across the room. But around Grant's table, everything stopped. One man stared into his coffee. Another woman slowly lowered her fork. Someone gave a short, uncomfortable laugh. Then nobody joined in. Naomi looked at Grant. Not with anger, not disbelief. She looked at him the way people look at a house they've lived in for years, right after realizing it no longer feels like home. It lasted only a few seconds. Then she turned back toward Ethan. "I'm sorry your evening became uncomfortable." The young waiter blinked. "No, ma'am." She placed the declined card back inside her purse, closed the clasp, stood. She looked around the table. "I hope the foundation reaches its goal tonight." Then she smiled politely. "Please excuse me." No speech, no accusation, no tears. She simply walked away. The ballroom seemed apart for her without anyone saying a word. Grant expected her to stop. She didn't. He expected her to turn around. She didn't. He expected anger. Instead, he got dignity. And somehow, that felt much worse. Across the ballroom, two senior executives from First Heritage Private Bank watched Naomi leave. One of their phones vibrated. He glanced at the screen. His expression changed immediately. The executive beside him leaned over. "What happened?" The man quietly turned the phone so only he could see. A secure, internal notification. Compliance review escalated. Immediate account. Safeguards activated. The second executive frowned. "Tonight?" He nodded once. Neither man looked toward Grant. They both looked toward the ballroom doors Naomi had just walked through. Neither understood the full picture yet. But both knew one thing. Whatever had just happened at that table, it was no longer only a private embarrassment. Grant finally reached into his pocket for his phone. His smile disappeared. He opened the banking app. The card still showed as locked. He frowned. That wasn't possible. He touched the screen. Unlock card. An error appeared. Action unavailable while security restrictions are active. Contact institution administrator. Grant stared at the message. He tried again. Same result. For the first time that evening, a cold feeling settled into his stomach. Something had changed. Something he hadn't planned. Something much bigger than a cruel joke. And for the first time, Grant realized he might not understand what had actually happened. Naomi didn't cry on the drive home. She expected to. Instead, she kept hearing Ethan's voice. "I'm so sorry, ma'am." Poor kid. He'd probably spend the rest of the night wondering if he'd ruined someone's marriage. He hadn't. He'd simply been standing where it finally became impossible to pretend one still existed. The streets of Winter Park were unusually quiet. Storefront lights reflected across the pavement after a brief evening shower. She drove the familiar route without turning on the radio. Silence felt kinder. Grant remained at the gala, at least physically. People continued approaching him, congratulating him, talking about donations, upcoming events. Business opportunities, he answered, almost automatically. His attention stayed fixed on the banking app. He refreshed it again. Same message. Action unavailable while security restrictions are active. That wasn't supposed to happen. He hadn't frozen the account. Only the card. Why couldn't he unlock it? A familiar voice interrupted his thoughts. Grant. He looked up. Claire stood beside him. What happened? He forced a laugh. Small misunderstanding. She studied his face. It didn't look small. He lowered his voice. The card wouldn't work. Claire glanced toward the ballroom doors. And Naomi? She left. Claire didn't answer immediately. Instead, she asked a question he wasn't expecting. Did you lock the card? Grant looked at her. How did you? You told me once you could. He rubbed his forehead. It was supposed to be, I don't know. A joke? He nodded. I was going to unlock it immediately. And? I couldn't. Claire frowned. What do you mean you couldn't? I don't know. He held up the phone. It won't let me. She read the message on the screen. For the first time since they'd met, Claire looked genuinely uneasy. I don't think this is about the joke anymore. Grant looked at her. What does that mean? I don't know. She handed the phone back. But if a financial institution overrides a security setting. She paused. Something else is happening. Neither of them spoke after that. Across town, the lights inside First Heritage Private Bank were still on. The compliance review had entered a different stage. Not because anyone believed misconduct had been proven, because the automated safeguards had detected additional activity while investigators were already reviewing related accounts. The compliance director stood beside a conference table covered with files. A younger analyst looked up from his laptop. We've confirmed the timestamps. And? They don't match. The director nodded once. No assumptions. No assumptions. Expand the review. All connected advisory relationships? All of them. Another analyst hesitated. What about governance? The director looked toward the closed conference room door. The governance committee remains recused. Mrs. Holloway included? Especially Mrs. Holloway. Professional integrity wasn't measured by protecting powerful people. It was measured by treating them exactly like everyone else. Naomi reached home just before 11. The house greeted her with the same quiet warmth it always had. The porch light was still on. Grant had left it burning before they left for the gala. A small thing, a thoughtful thing, the kind of habit built over years. She unlocked the front door, stepped inside, closed it gently behind her. Nothing looked different. Their wedding photograph still hung above the fireplace. His reading glasses rested beside the couch. A half-finished crossword waited on the coffee table. The life they'd built hadn't disappeared. Only the certainty inside it had. She walked upstairs, removed her earrings, placed the bracelet her mother had given her back into its velvet box. Then she looked at her wedding ring. For nearly a minute, she simply stared at it, not because she wanted to take it off, because she wasn't sure she still understood what it represented. Finally, she slipped it from her finger. The pale line beneath it caught her attention. She had worn that ring every day since Grant placed it on her hand beside Lake Virginia. Now it rested quietly on the dresser, beside her father's leather notebook. She opened the notebook, not searching for answers, only familiarity. A page near the middle carried a sentence written years earlier in blue ink. Never protect a relationship by sacrificing your integrity. You'll lose both. Naomi closed the notebook. This time, the tears finally came. Not loud, not dramatic, just enough to acknowledge what her heart had known since she thanked Ethan and walked out of that ballroom. Close to midnight, Grant unlocked the front door. The house was dark. Naomi? No answer. He walked upstairs. The bedroom lamp was off. He assumed she'd fallen asleep. As he loosened his tie, something caught his eye. Her wedding ring, resting neatly beside the leather notebook. His stomach dropped. Grant sat slowly on the edge of the bed. He picked up the ring. It still felt warm, as if she'd taken it off only moments earlier. For the first time that night, he stopped thinking about the investigation. He stopped thinking about the declined card. He stopped thinking about Claire. He finally understood what Naomi's silence had been trying to tell him. The cruel joke he thought would last 30 seconds had ended something that had taken years to build. And downstairs, his phone vibrated again. Another message from the bank. He looked at the screen, then back at the empty space beside him in bed. For the first time in years, Grant realized he had no idea which loss should frighten him more. Grant barely slept. Every time he closed his eyes, he saw the same thing. Not the declined card, not the guests, not even Naomi walking away. He saw her thanking Ethan, as if she had been protecting a complete stranger from the humiliation her own husband had caused. He finally gave up trying to sleep and arrived at the office before sunrise. For years, being first into the building had made him feel successful. This morning, it only made the silence louder. He unlocked his office, set his briefcase on the floor, poured coffee. His phone buzzed before he even sat down. "Mark, need to see you as soon as you arrive." No, "Good morning." No smiley face, no explanation. Grant stared at the message. His stomach tightened. Mark's office overlooked downtown Winter Park. Normally, the view felt calming. Today, Grant barely noticed it. Mark stood beside the window. The firm's chief compliance officer sat at the conference table with 2 folders already open. Neither man smiled. "Morning," Grant said. Mark nodded. "Close the door." Grant did. "What's going on?" Mark looked toward the compliance officer. "You should explain." The compliance officer slid one folder across the table. "We received another request from First Heritage Private Bank." Grant sat down. "They've already asked for records." "They're asking for more." "What kind?" "Transaction authorizations." "We sent those." "They want the original approval timelines." Grant frowned. "I don't understand." "We're trying to understand too." The compliance officer opened another page. "There are several transactions where documentation appears to have been finalized after funds had already moved." Grant immediately shook his head. "There has to be an explanation." "There may be." The man remained calm. "That's exactly why we're asking questions." Grant leaned forward. "I didn't bypass procedures." "No one has said you did. But you're looking at me like I did." Mark finally spoke. "Grant." His voice sounded tired. "Help us answer the questions before somebody else starts answering them for us." By lunchtime, word had already started spreading. Not the facts, never the facts, only fragments. A banker had requested records. Someone mentioned an internal review. Someone else heard a client had delayed transferring assets. No one knew the full story. That didn't stop them from discussing it. Winter Park had always been small enough for whispers to travel faster than headlines. Grant discovered that the hard way. He walked into his usual coffee shop. The cashier smiled politely. "Morning, Mr. Holloway." "Morning." 2 men near the window stopped talking the moment he walked in. One looked away. The other nodded awkwardly. Grant ordered his coffee. As he waited, he caught a few words drifting from another table. "Probably nothing." "Still doesn't look good." "Heard it involved compliance." He couldn't tell whether they were talking about him. That was almost worse. Across town, Naomi's morning looked almost ordinary. She arrived at First Heritage just before 8, greeted the security guard by name, stopped to ask one of the tellers how her grandson's baseball tournament had gone. She carried no visible sign that anything had changed, only the wedding ring missing from her hand. Most people didn't notice. Those who did said nothing. She preferred it that way. Inside her office, a confidential envelope waited on her desk. She recognized the handwriting immediately. The chief compliance officer. She opened it. 1 page. Confirmation of formal recusal. Her request had been approved. Effective immediately, she would receive no further information regarding any investigation connected to her husband's firm. Exactly what she had asked for. She signed the acknowledgement, placed it back inside the envelope, pressed the intercom. "Could someone return this to compliance, please?" "Of course, Ms. Holloway." That was all. No questions, no curiosity. Professional boundaries remained intact. Her father would have been proud. Late that afternoon, Grant received another call. One of his oldest clients, Richard Donnelly. Grant answered immediately. "Richard, have you got a minute?" "Always." The older man hesitated. "I've been hearing some things." Grant closed his office door. "I figured you might. I'm not calling to accuse you. I know. I wanted to hear it from you." Grant looked out the window. "It's an internal review. Anything I should be worried about?" The question hurt, not because it was unfair, because Richard had trusted him for 12 years. Now, he was asking whether that trust had been misplaced. Grant answered honestly, "I don't believe I've done anything intentionally wrong." There was a long silence. Finally, Richard spoke. "I hope that's enough." The call ended politely, respectfully, but Grant understood something the moment he lowered the phone. 6 months earlier, Richard would have ended that conversation by saying, "I know you'll figure it out." He hadn't. Trust wasn't disappearing dramatically. It was leaving quietly, one conversation at a time. And Grant was beginning to understand that losing confidence from people who once believed in you felt far heavier than losing money ever could. Grant waited 4 more days before going to the bank, not because he wanted to, because pride kept telling him the situation would solve itself. It didn't. Instead, another client postponed signing paperwork. A second requested copies of compliance disclosures. A third quietly transferred half of his portfolio to another advisor. No one accused Grant of dishonesty. They simply became cautious, and caution had begun costing him years of work. Late Friday afternoon, Grant parked across the street from First Heritage Private Bank. He sat behind the steering wheel for almost 10 minutes. He hadn't told Naomi he was coming. He wasn't even sure what he was going to say. Finally, he took a deep breath and walked inside. The marble lobby looked exactly as it always had, elegant, quiet, professional. Nothing about the building reflected the storm unfolding around him. A receptionist smiled warmly. "Good afternoon. I'm here to see Naomi Holloway." "Do you have an appointment?" "No." She checked her screen. "I'll see if she's available." A few minutes later, the elevator doors opened. Naomi stepped into the lobby carrying a folder. She stopped when she saw him. Neither smiled. "Hi," Grant said. "Hi. You have a minute?" She looked toward the receptionist. "Walk with me." They stepped outside onto the shaded sidewalk. For a while, they simply walked beneath the old oak trees lining the street. Grant finally spoke. "I need your help." Naomi kept looking ahead. "What kind of help?" "The investigation." She closed her eyes briefly, then opened them again. "Grant, I know you know people. I do. They'll listen to you." She stopped walking. "So will you." He looked confused. "What?" "Listen carefully." Her voice stayed calm. "I removed myself from that investigation weeks ago." Grant frowned. "What do you mean?" "I formally recused myself." "Why would you do that?" "So no one could ever say I protected my husband instead of protecting the institution." He stared at her. "You already knew?" "I knew there were questions." "You never told me." "I legally couldn't." "You could have warned me." She looked at him for a long moment. "I did." Grant blinked. "What?" "I warned you every time I asked whether you were all right. Every time I asked if something had changed. Every time I gave you the chance to tell me the truth." He lowered his eyes. Neither of them spoke for several seconds. Finally, he whispered, "I wasn't talking about Claire." "I know. You knew?" "I knew enough." Grant swallowed. "I never meant—" She gently interrupted him. "I believe that." He looked surprised. "You do? I don't think you woke up one morning wanting to become this man." She paused. "But intention doesn't erase consequences." Grant looked away. "I thought if I worked harder—" "You did." "I thought if I became more successful." "You did." "I don't understand how everything still fell apart." Naomi smiled sadly. "Because success wasn't what our marriage was hungry for." The sentence settled between them. Grant rubbed both hands across his face. "I don't know how to fix this." She answered quietly, "You don't fix trust by asking someone else to protect you." He looked at her. "Then, what do I do?" "The only thing you can do." "And what's that?" "Tell the truth. To the investigators. To your partners." She held his eyes. "And to yourself." Grant hesitated before asking the question that had bothered him since the gala. "Can I ask you something?" She nodded. "How much authority do you actually have here?" Naomi smiled faintly. "I wondered when you'd ask. I thought you handled governance." "I do." "I thought you attended board meetings." "I do." "I thought your father made the important decisions." "He did." Grant waited. "My father also prepared for the day he wouldn't be here." She spoke without pride. "He transferred controlling voting authority into the family trust before he passed away." Grant frowned. "The family trust?" "I chair it." The words landed almost silently. Grant simply stared at her. "The board?" She nodded once. "I appointed with the trustees." He looked back at the bank behind her. The pieces suddenly fit together. Why senior executives always treated Naomi with unusual respect. Why people listened when she spoke. Why she'd never needed introductions. Why she'd never once mentioned any of it. He let out a slow breath. "You could have changed my career with one phone call." "I could have." "You never did. You never asked." He looked down. "I thought—" She finished the sentence for him. "You thought I didn't have much influence." Grant couldn't deny it. She smiled sadly. "I never wanted you to admire me because of my position. I wanted you to love me without needing it." A long silence followed. Cars rolled slowly past. The afternoon sun filtered through the oak branches above them. Grant finally understood something that should have been obvious years ago. Naomi had spent their entire marriage making sure her family's influence never became his shortcut. She had protected his independence, while he spent months believing she wasn't ambitious enough to understand his success. He looked at her. "I'm sorry." This time, he wasn't apologizing because he'd been caught. He was apologizing because he finally understood what he had destroyed. Naomi believed him. She truly did. But belief and trust were no longer the same thing. She gave him a small, tired smile. "I hope you become the man I always believed you could be." Grant's eyes filled. "But I can't become him for you." With that, Naomi turned and walked back toward the bank. Grant didn't follow. For the first time since the gala, he understood that the hardest consequences weren't waiting inside conference rooms. They were walking away from him one quiet step at a time. Grant walked back into his office feeling older than he had that morning. Naomi hadn't yelled. She hadn't insulted him. She hadn't threatened him. For some reason, that hurt more. He closed his office door and sat in silence. The framed awards on the bookshelf suddenly looked like decorations from somebody else's life. His phone buzzed. "Claire." He stared at the screen before answering. "Hey, you sound awful." "It's been a long day." "I heard you went to the bank." Grant frowned. "How did you know that?" There was a tiny pause. "People talk." He nodded to himself. Of course they did. Winter Park always talked. Claire's voice softened. "How bad is it?" "I don't know anymore." "What did Naomi say?" Grant looked out the window. "She told me to tell the truth." Claire let out a slow breath. "That's probably good advice." Grant blinked. He hadn't expected that answer. "I thought you'd tell me to fight." "You can't fight facts." Another silence. Different this time. Uneasy. Grant finally asked, "Can I ask you something?" "Sure." "If none of this had happened, if the investigation never started, where did you think this was going?" Claire didn't answer immediately. When she finally spoke, her voice sounded smaller. "I don't know." "You don't know?" "I never planned that far." Grant leaned back. For the first time since they'd met, he wasn't hearing confidence. He was hearing uncertainty. "You told me I deserved more." I believed you did. You told me I'd outgrown my marriage. I said I thought you were unhappy. Grant closed his eyes. I wasn't. Claire stayed quiet. I was restless. Another pause. And I confused the two. Neither of them spoke. Finally, Claire sighed. I have another meeting. Grant nodded, even though she couldn't see him. Okay. Take care of yourself. You too. The call ended. It felt strangely formal, like two business associates finishing a contract. Nothing more. The following Monday, Grant arrived at a regional investment luncheon. Normally, people waved him over. This time, something felt different. Conversations didn't stop. They simply moved without him. One executive who had once insisted Grant join every table smiled politely from across the room, but he didn't invite him over. Another gave a quick nod before turning back to his conversation. Grant stood, holding a cup of coffee. Alone. It wasn't dramatic. Nobody insulted him. Nobody embarrassed him. He had simply become less valuable. Across the ballroom, Claire stood speaking with a prominent real estate developer. Grant started walking toward them, then stopped. The developer shook Claire's hand. They laughed together. Claire glanced in Grant's direction. For half a second, their eyes met. She looked away first. She continued talking. She never introduced him. Grant quietly lowered his coffee. The realization landed with painful clarity. The woman who had spent months telling him how exceptional he was had just decided he was no longer useful to stand beside. He didn't feel angry, only tired. That evening, another client called, then another. One postponed a meeting. One requested a different advisor. One simply thanked Grant for years of service and wished him well. Every conversation ended politely. Every conversation took something with it. Meanwhile, Naomi's days looked almost unchanged. She continued arriving at the bank before most executives. She still greeted security officers by name, still checked on employees recovering from surgery, still attended committee meetings. She never discussed Grant, not once. One afternoon, a young analyst accidentally dropped an entire stack of client files across the hallway. Papers scattered everywhere. Before anyone else reacted, Naomi knelt beside him. It's all right. I'm so sorry, Ms. Holloway. Happens to everyone. She handed him the folders one by one. The young man looked embarrassed. I've only been here 3 weeks. She smiled. Then this is early enough to become a funny story someday. Several employees quietly smiled as they walked past. Nobody applauded. Nobody made a speech. Respect didn't need an audience. Later that afternoon, Naomi entered the executive boardroom. Conversations naturally paused, not because people feared her, because they trusted her. Grant had spent months chasing admiration. Naomi had spent years earning confidence. They looked similar from a distance. Up close, they couldn't have been more different. That evening, Grant drove home before sunset. The house felt strangely peaceful. He unlocked the front door. The smell of fresh bread drifted from the kitchen. For one impossible second, his heart lifted. Maybe things weren't beyond repair. Naomi? No answer. He walked into the kitchen. A loaf of homemade bread rested on the cooling rack. Beside it sat a handwritten note. Not from Naomi. From their elderly next-door neighbor. Naomi helped me bake today. I accidentally made 2 loaves. This one's for you, Dorothy. Grant stared at the note. Naomi had still thought about him. Even now, she had accepted bread from a neighbor and made sure 1 loaf came home for him. She hadn't stopped being kind. She had only stopped believing kindness alone could save a marriage. Grant slowly sat at the kitchen table. He broke off a piece of the still warm bread. It tasted exactly like every ordinary evening they'd shared over the years. For the first time, he understood what he'd actually been mourning. It wasn't the investigation. It wasn't his reputation. It wasn't even Claire. It was the quiet life he'd once considered too ordinary to appreciate. And now, it was becoming the one thing money couldn't buy back. The investigation concluded 7 weeks later. It didn't happen with television cameras, or reporters standing outside office buildings, or dramatic courtroom scenes. Real consequences rarely arrive that way. They arrive in conference rooms, inside sealed envelopes. across tables where nobody raises their voice. Grant sat between his attorney and the managing partners of Holloway Financial Partners. A representative from the Regulatory Review Committee finished reading the final findings. Several transactions had been processed with documentation completed outside required timelines. The investigation found no evidence that Grant had stolen client money, no evidence that he had created the irregularities for personal enrichment, but it also found something impossible to ignore. He had approved exceptions too casually. He had trusted verbal assurances instead of established procedures. He had allowed the pressure to keep important clients happy to replace the discipline that had built his reputation. It wasn't fraud, it was negligence, professional negligence, the kind that destroys confidence just as effectively. The committee chair folded the report. Mr. Holloway, we believe your earlier work reflected integrity. Grant looked up. The older man continued. We also believe your recent decisions reflected compromised judgment. Grant lowered his eyes. He couldn't argue, because somewhere along the way, he had stopped believing rules protected people. He had started believing they slowed successful people down. The chair spoke again. Your advisory license will remain under disciplinary restriction pending completion of corrective requirements. Grant nodded once. I understand. And your partnership interest, Mark quietly finished the sentence, will be reduced effective immediately. Grant signed every document without reading them twice. There was nothing left to negotiate. The punishment wasn't what hurt. The truth was, outside the building, reporters weren't waiting. Nobody recognized him. Traffic moved normally. People carried coffee. A young couple laughed while crossing the street. Life continued. Grant stood beside his car, holding the envelope containing 20 years of work. He realized something strange. The world almost never stops because one person loses everything they thought defined them. That afternoon, he drove somewhere he hadn't visited in months. The little cafe, the one with terrible coffee, and the lemon pie. The waitress recognized him immediately. It's been a while. It has. The usual? He smiled faintly. I think so. She returned a few minutes later carrying coffee and one slice of pie. Grant stared at it. He remembered Naomi laughing the first time she'd tasted it. The coffee's terrible. I told you. Then why bring me here? Because I wanted an excuse to keep talking to you. Back then, he hadn't needed admiration. Conversation had been enough. He sat there alone until the pie was gone. Across town, Naomi attended a staff appreciation luncheon. No cameras, no speeches about herself. Instead, she moved from table to table, thanking employees who had spent decades serving families they barely knew. A teller retiring after 38 years. A custodian who never missed a morning shift. A loan officer celebrating his 50th birthday. As the luncheon ended, one of the youngest employees caught up with her. Miss Holloway. She turned. I wanted to thank you. For what? When I started here. The young woman smiled nervously. I was terrified. Naomi laughed softly. I remember. You told me something my first week. What was that? People remember how safe you made them feel long after they forget what you said. The young employee smiled. I still think about that. Naomi smiled too. So do I. She walked away before anyone could thank her again. She had never been interested in being the most important person in the room, only in leaving people a little steadier than she found them. And somehow, that quiet way of living had built a reputation stronger than anything money could buy. Grant didn't ask Naomi to meet him until nearly 3 months had passed. He wrote the message 4 times before sending it, then deleted it 4 times. Finally, he stopped trying to sound wise. Would you have coffee with me? No expectations. I just owe you the truth. He almost deleted that one too. Instead, he pressed send. Naomi didn't answer immediately. She read the message during a lunch break, locked her phone, finished the meeting she was already in. Only after she returned to her office did she reply. 1 hour. Saturday. The cafe. No smile. No anger. Just a time and a place. Grant understood. She wasn't giving him another chance. She was giving him one honest conversation. There was a difference. Saturday morning arrived cool and unusually quiet. The little cafe hadn't changed. The coffee was still terrible. The lemon pie still occupied the center of the display case. Grant arrived 20 minutes early. Old habit. Or maybe nervousness. He wasn't sure. When Naomi walked through the door, she wore the same simple blue sweater she'd worn countless weekends before. No expensive jewelry. No dramatic entrance. She smiled politely. Hi. Hi. He stood automatically. She sat across from him. For a few moments, neither reached for the menu. The waitress walked over and smiled. I haven't seen you two together in a while. Grant felt something tighten in his chest. Naomi answered gently. It's been a busy season. The waitress nodded. The usual? They looked at each other. Grant smiled sadly. I think so. When the waitress walked away, silence settled over the table. Not awkward, just careful. Grant folded his hands together. I practiced this conversation. Naomi smiled faintly. I figured. It sounded better in my head. It usually does. He laughed once. The first genuine laugh he'd managed in weeks. Then it disappeared. I've spent months thinking the affair ruined our marriage. Naomi looked at him quietly. I was wrong. She didn't interrupt. I keep replaying everything. The conferences, the lunches, the messages. He shook his head. That wasn't where I lost you. No, it started long before Claire. Naomi nodded once. It did. Grant looked down at the table. I stopped respecting ordinary things. He swallowed. I started needing people to admire me. His voice cracked slightly. And once that happened, nothing you quietly gave me ever felt big enough. Naomi watched him for a long moment. Then she asked one simple question. When did you realize it? He didn't answer immediately. Instead, he looked toward the pie in the display case. The bread. She frowned slightly. Our neighbor. He smiled sadly. I came home and found that loaf sitting on the counter. He looked back at her. You still thought about me? Even after everything. I realized I'd spent months chasing people who celebrated my success, while taking for granted the woman who remembered how I liked my coffee. Naomi laughed softly. You never liked the coffee. He smiled. No, only the company. For the first time that morning, they both laughed. Not because anything was funny, because the memory still belonged to both of them. When the laughter faded, Grant became serious again. I don't want you back because I lost everything. Naomi listened. I want you to know that if I could change one thing. He stopped, then shook his head. No, that's still not honest. She waited. I'd change 1,000 small things. He looked directly at her. I'd come home earlier. I'd tell you about my day. I'd stop trying to impress people who were never planning to stay. I'd thank you more. I'd listen. I'd choose ordinary Saturdays over impressive Thursdays. A tear escaped before he noticed it. I thought I was protecting my future. He smiled bitterly. I was walking away from it. Naomi sat quietly for several seconds. Then she reached into her purse. Grant's heart raced. She placed something on the table. It wasn't divorce papers. It wasn't a photograph. It was the little notebook, the one she'd started months earlier. She gently turned it toward him. You should read the first page. Grant opened it. The first sentence stared back at him. Things that don't feel like us. He kept reading. Not accusations, not evidence. Small moments, canceled dinners, short conversations, forgotten stories, missed walks, tiny absences, page after page, their marriage disappearing in inches instead of miles. Grant closed the notebook. His hands trembled. I thought you'd been collecting proof. Naomi shook her head. I was trying to protect my memory, so I wouldn't someday convince myself none of it happened. Grant nodded slowly. I deserved that. No. She looked at him gently. You deserved honesty." Another long silence followed. Finally, Grant asked the question he had feared since sending the message. "Is there any chance?" He couldn't finish. Naomi understood anyway. She looked out the cafe window toward the lake where people walked beneath the oak trees. When she finally spoke, her voice carried no anger. Only peace. "I've forgiven you, Grant." He closed his eyes. "But forgiveness." She looked back at him. "Isn't the same thing as rebuilding trust." He nodded. Tears quietly filled his eyes again. This time, he didn't try to hide them. For the first time, in a very long time, he had stopped defending himself. And somehow, that felt like the first honest thing he'd done in years. Autumn arrived quietly in Winter Park. The tourists thinned out. The mornings became cooler. The farmer's market looked almost exactly as it always had. Fresh flowers, local honey, homemade bread, children pulling impatiently at their parents' hands. Life had a remarkable way of continuing. Grant came because he'd started coming again every Saturday. At first, he wasn't sure why. Maybe because it reminded him of the man he'd once been. Maybe because memories deserved somewhere to live. He walked slowly between the stalls, carrying a paper cup of coffee that was still too hot to drink. The flower stand stood exactly where it always had. Mrs. Alvarez, who had owned it for nearly 20 years, smiled the moment she recognized him. "Well," she laughed, "I was beginning to think you'd forgotten us." Grant smiled. "I almost forgot myself for a while." She tilted her head. "That's an honest answer." He picked up a small bouquet of white lilies. "They're beautiful." "They always were." She wrapped the flowers carefully, then looked over his shoulder. "Oh." Grant turned. Naomi had just entered the market. She carried a woven basket over one arm. No security, no assistance, no expensive designer handbag, just Naomi, exactly the way she'd always preferred to be. Mrs. Alvarez smiled brightly. "There she is." Naomi walked over. "Good morning." "Morning." For the first time in months. Their conversation wasn't heavy. It wasn't filled with unfinished history. It was simply two familiar people standing in a place that had once belonged to both of them. Mrs. Alvarez looked between them. "You know," she grinned, "I still remember when you two couldn't agree on flowers." Naomi laughed softly. "Grant always bought whatever looked expensive." Grant smiled. "And you always bought whatever was already starting to wilt." Mrs. Alvarez frowned playfully. "I never understood that." Naomi gently touched one of the small potted daisies. "My father used to say the flowers that need the most care usually bloom the longest." The older woman smiled. "He was a wise man." "He was." Mrs. Alvarez looked toward another waiting customer. "I'll be right back." She walked away, leaving them alone. Neither rushed to fill the silence. Grant finally looked at Naomi. "I heard the community scholarship program opened another branch." She nodded. "It did. Congratulations." "Thank you. My clients used to talk about investment returns." A small smile crossed his face. "Now they talk about what your program has done for their grandchildren." Naomi looked genuinely surprised. "They do? They're proud of you." She lowered her eyes for a moment. "I'm proud of them." Grant smiled. "That's the difference." She looked back at him. "What is?" "I always wanted people to admire me." He looked around the market. "You always wanted people to feel seen." Neither said anything after that, because nothing more needed saying. Mrs. Alvarez returned, carrying the wrapped lilies. She handed them to Grant. "For your mother?" Grant looked at the flowers, then slowly shook his head. "No." He smiled gently. "For me." Mrs. Alvarez blinked. "Well." She laughed warmly. "There's nothing wrong with that." Grant paid for the flowers. As Naomi picked up a small bundle of fresh herbs, she turned toward him one last time. "I hope you're doing all right." Grant answered honestly. "Some days are harder than others." She nodded. "They probably should be." He smiled. "I think you're right." Then she said something that stayed with him, long after she disappeared into the crowd. "I'm glad you're becoming someone you don't have to pretend to be." She walked away. Grant didn't follow. He didn't call after her. Love had taught him many things. One of the hardest was learning that respecting someone sometimes means allowing them to keep walking. Months later, a newly hired advisor joined Grant's small rebuilt practice. The young man had talent, confidence, and the same restless ambition Grant once carried. One evening, after a difficult client meeting, the young advisor threw a file onto the desk. "I don't get it." Grant looked up. "What happened?" "I did everything right." "You probably did. Then why didn't they trust me?" Grant smiled faintly. He remembered asking himself the same question years earlier. He closed the folder in front of him. "Can I tell you something someone once forgot to teach me?" The young man nodded. Grant leaned back in his chair. "People don't hand you their confidence because you're impressive." He paused. "They hand it to you because they feel safe." The young advisor sat quietly. Grant continued, "If you ever have to choose between looking successful and being trustworthy." He smiled sadly. "Choose trustworthy. You'll sleep better." That evening, Grant drove home beneath a sky turning gold with sunset. His house was smaller now. His office was smaller too. His life looked very different from the one he'd spent years chasing. But for the first time in a long time, it felt honest. He walked inside, placed the lilies in a simple glass vase, made himself a cup of terrible coffee, and, almost without thinking, cut himself a slice of lemon pie from the bakery down the street. He laughed quietly. Some traditions were worth keeping. On the bookshelf beside the kitchen sat Naomi's father's leather notebook. Months earlier, Naomi had returned it after removing the few family pages she wanted to keep. Grant opened it occasionally, not to punish himself, to remember. One sentence remained folded inside the cover on a small piece of paper in Naomi's handwriting. He had never asked when she placed it there. It simply read, "Character isn't revealed by how people treat you when they need you. It's revealed by how you treat people when you think they'll never change your life." Grant looked out the kitchen window as the last light disappeared beyond the trees. He finally understood why Naomi had thanked Ethan before walking away. Kindness had never depended on who deserved it. It reflected who she had chosen to become, and that was something no fortune, no title, no applause could ever buy, because money can rebuild a business. Time can soften regret. Even reputations can slowly recover. But trust is never purchased. It's earned quietly, one ordinary day at a time. Before you go, I'd love to hear your thoughts. Do you think Naomi made the right decision by walking away, even after Grant finally told the truth? Or do you believe some marriages deserve a second chance when genuine remorse comes too late? Share your thoughts in the comments. I read as many of them as I can, and some of the best conversations happen right there. And if this story reminded you that trust is built in the little things and can be lost the same way, please take a moment to like this video and subscribe to Mr. Graham Stories. It helps us keep bringing you heartfelt stories that stay with you long after they're over. Until next time, take care of yourselves, and take care of the people who quietly make your life better every single day.
Thank you for watching Mr. Graham Stories, my beautiful, amazing family.